It had a huge effect. Because of it, the left is divided. Many people have been uncertain about Russian interference and how dangerous the Trump presidency is. As one researcher said, the purpose of disinformation is not to convince. The purpose of disinformation is to confuse. It's to create muddled thinking across society. Before we start the slides, I want to introduce my tech guy, magically appearing, Andrew Berman, my husband. And thank you, Andy, for your help with this. One result, slide, of the disinformation is that we have not had the massive protests that we should have had throughout Trump's presidency. There were not huge protests during impeachment. Here are some of the headlines asking, where are the protests? We've needed protests against Trump that were as large as the Black Lives Matter protests. Instead, tens of thousands of hours have been spent arguing about Syria and Russian interference, time that could have been spent organizing. And I'll be going through the slides pretty quickly, but they'll be posted on Facebook afterwards. People will not get out there and organize protests if they're not sure of what's happening. The disinformation has been very destructive to having an effective, united left. The peace movement opposes bombing, nuclear, chemical warfare, drones, but we don't even acknowledge that foreign disinformation is another form of warfare. There's an assumption that Russian propaganda is not very sophisticated. The opposite is true. It's so sophisticated that most of us don't even recognize it. Slide. RT Russia Today is a Russian government-funded outlet. Its founding editor has compared it with the Russian Army and Defense Ministry and talked about RT, quote, waging information war against the Western world, unquote. Russia recently passed a law forbidding disrespecting the Russian government online, punishable with a 15-day jail sentence. End. There is no place for independent journalism in Putin's Russia. Don't mistake RT for progressive journalism. It's a sophisticated example of information warfare, according to its own editor. Syria activists were among the first to spot some of the sophisticated foreign disinformation back in 2012. And we know how powerful it is. We've fought it for 8 years. On one hand, we've worked with hundreds of Syrians, activists, nonviolence advocates, writers, academics, young people, who all described a genuine revolution against the brutal Assad dictatorship. On the other hand, Western left writers have been telling us that it is a US regime change operation to overthrow Assad. Yes, many proxy forces entered the war, but at heart, it's been Assad bombing and killing the Syrian people. However, because of the disinformation, much of the left is unsure or believes the line that it's a US regime change operation. This has created a very divisive split in the peace movement. Next. Historians tell us to go to the original source, and that would be Syrians. This slide shows some of the many books by Syrians about the war. They describe a courageous revolution against Assad. Next. This slide shows some of the documentary films by Syrians. Same. They show Syrians' lives in the revolutionary struggle. I know of no books or films by Syrians that support the US regime change line. Unfortunately, the left internet has been dominated by articles by Western writers and articles that echo Assad and Russia's talking points about US regime change. Who's the reliable source on Syria? Syrians themselves or Western writers? New slide. A study from a research lab at the University of Washington showed that in the summer of 2017, there were 4 times as many disinformation tweets compared to tweets from factual articles, tweets about the Syrian White Helmets, a volunteer rescue group. The blue cluster are the disinformation tweets. The purple cluster in the left corner is the mainstream media. The White Helmet's cameras provide evidence that Assad and Russia are bombing civilians, committing war crimes. Hence the disinformation campaign to discredit them. End. So 4 times as many tweets linked to disinformation. No wonder we've had a difficult time countering it. The disinformation simply overwhelmed the truth. Slide. The UW study also identified so-called independent alternative media, this is the first column, involved in spreading the anti-White Helmets disinformation. The study called it an ecosystem with Russian, Syrian, and Iranian government-funded media. They are promoting the talking points of those governments. The second column is related media that share some of the same themes. Early in 2016, we started noticing that some of these same so-called progressive media that were pro-Assad, next, also had the same line on the US election, trashing Clinton as the worst warmongering, next, evil, next, corrupt president ever, next, equating Clinton and Trump. They're both just clowns. Next, going easy on Trump and discouraging voting. Again, these will be on Facebook later. These memes were shared tens of thousands of times. You probably saw some of them. These were not the election ads paid for in Russian rubles. They were posts by supposedly progressive sites, the pro-Assad sites. I know these vicious anti-Clinton memes influence Facebook friends. Next. This is the one disparaging voting. These memes dominated Facebook. We observed these pro-Assad sites, the Free Thought Project, the Anti-Media, and others helped depress the progressive vote for Clinton. Next. Allison Gill's story illustrates the problem. She was a strong Bernie supporter in 2016 and was so bombarded with negative messages about Clinton that she almost didn't vote. She later realized that those messages came from, quote, bots, trolls, and manipulated US persons, unquote. And she sees it happening again in 2020. End. Democrats who stayed home in 2016 cost Clinton the election. She got roughly 10 million fewer votes than Obama in 2012. All the disinformation articles and memes directed at left and Black voters certainly played a role. Mary mentioned Timothy Snyder. He's a Yale historian whose focus is authoritarian regimes. In describing how Russia defeated America in 2016, he makes one point that really should be obvious. Russia created the persona of Trump, the successful businessman. As Snyder says, Trump was a spectacularly failed businessman. Next. When US banks refused to lend to him in the 1990s, he was rescued by licensing deals and Russian infusions of cash, which allowed him to present himself as a successful businessman. Don Jr. said in 2008, "We see a lot of money pouring in from Russia." And without Russian money, we wouldn't have had Trump on The Apprentice TV show, or Trump as a candidate for president, or Trump as president. Next slide. Shortly after the election, the 2016 election, articles about Russian propaganda in our election started to appear. Next. Immediately, left writers lined up to denounce the idea of Russian influence. Glenn Greenwald, Stephen Cohen, Matt Taibbi, Norman Solomon, Robert Perry, Max Blumenthal, and others scoffed at the idea of Russian interference. They said it was just the Democrats' excuse for losing to Trump, the new McCarthyism, Russia hysteria, overblown. There is great reluctance by the left to make Russia the enemy and return to the hostilities of the Cold War era. The Russiagate skepticism builds on that. Next. But in fact, in the last 3.5 years, there's been extensive evidence of Russian interference. from the Mueller report. Next, reports from the EU. Recent info that Mueller was blocked from even probing Trump's Russia ties. Next, and the bombshell Senate report in August, where even the Republicans say there was an aggressive, multifaceted attempt by the Russians to influence the elections. And despite all this information, there are still, in 2020, writers who denounce the claims of Russian interference. Let's be clear, they are supporting Trump and Putin's position by doing so. Why are these so-called progressive media, The Intercept, The Nation, Gray Zone, Chris Hedges, continually defending Trump and Putin and Russia? Money, ideology, the influence of other left writers? How could the CIA and FBI be right and Chris Hedges and Glenn Greenwald be wrong? But Chris Hedges is paid by the Russian government. He's had a regular show on RT for a couple of years. We don't know the motivation of other Russiagate skeptics. Result, some of my progressive acquaintances have been unsure about Russian interference. Next, a Senate report in 2018 looked at millions of Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook posts for 3 years, from 2014 through 2017. These originated from Russia's Internet Research Agency. The disinformation began well before 2014, and it continues today. We know the CIA has done this for years in other countries, but that doesn't make it okay for other countries to interfere here. All interference in other nations is wrong. End. Of course, there is still disinformation now around the 2020 elections. But election disinformation is not just the disinformation for a few months before the elections. It's the continuation of years of those themes, equating Democrats and Republicans, encouraging cynicism about voting, years of downplaying Trump's crimes. The left sites that push Russiagate skepticism are still relatively easy on Trump, not outraged by his authoritarianism. They aren't giving much coverage to Trump's disastrous handling of COVID, not much coverage to Barr's authoritarian moves, or to Trump's secret police, or to his actions accelerating climate change. So it's not just the false information, it's also what is not covered that can influence us. There is a long history on the left of equating the two parties as being part of the same corrupt system. The disinformation amplifies that line of thinking. Some of these media focus more on problems with the Democrats or problems with the system. So there are still people who don't see much difference between Trump and Biden. It's been a huge disservice to the left by these media to downplay how dangerous and criminal the Trump regime has been. Some of these same sites have been spreading the anti-Fauci, anti-science COVID conspiracy theories, adding to the confusion. We're on the verge of losing all democracy, of Trump stealing the elections, and parts of the left have not been clear about what has been happening. The disinformation has contributed to muddled thinking. Some people still haven't fully comprehended how critical it is that he be defeated, how important it is to the survival of the planet, to the retention of any democracy here. I think some of the recent revelations about Trump and Russia, about Attorney General Barr, and now Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death have helped make people aware of the authoritarian danger we're facing. This year, I don't see the memes everywhere on Facebook denouncing Biden and Harris like there were in 2016 against Clinton. Some of those sites were taken down by Facebook, and although they've republished, they have a fraction of their millions of followers. New slide. Here are just a couple sample anti-Biden posts from so-called progressive sites, equating Biden the rapist with Trump the rapist. Next. Other direction. Lee Camp has a show on Russia Today. Next. So Biden is the warmonger versus Trump. This is the Jimmy Dore show, which is part of this alternative media. And it's really impossible to calculate the damage that years of this disinformation and propaganda has had on us. The Russian disinformation exploits and amplifies existing divisions in our society. Divisions within the left, within the Black community, divisions between the left and the right. Also, many of the sites that push Russiagate skepticism don't encourage us to organize, don't tell us how we can fight back. With the post office problem, legitimate left sites promoted the protests, told people what they could do locally. The sites that are more pro-Assad, pro-Russia, encourage a cynicism, a hopelessness in how corrupt the system is, how the US is unraveling without any call for action. What can we do? How do we decide what's true, what's disinformation? I certainly don't have all the answers. Next slide. There are some basics about determining what is factual. Think for yourself, check your source, consult the fact checkers, Snopes, PolitiFact, Fact Check, wait for the whole story, be informed. Next. The Washington Post, New York Times, NPR, BBC are generally reliable sources. Yes, we know they're biased towards corporations and the US government. Mainstream media has many faults, but they do care about facts. One of the major propaganda themes from the Russian IRA is to distrust the mainstream media. That's a very common meme. Don't trust the mainstream media, but then you're supposed to trust these obscure sites that we have no idea who's behind them, who's funding them. And let's look at specific progressive sites. One easy thing to do to clear some disinformation from your sources is to eliminate media connected to the Russian government. Russia was the main source of disinformation in 2016. Their mission is information warfare against the Western world. Of course, there's this disinformation not connected to Russia, but Russia is a major source. RT and Sputnik are the two English language Russian TV stations. They're propaganda stations, not reliable. Two of the more well-known shows on RT are Chris Hedges' On Contact and Lee Camp's Redacted Tonight, not reliable. New slide. Last year, CNN exposed that In the Now, Wasted, and Soapbox were Russian-owned. Facebook and YouTube now identify them as Russian state-controlled media, but they're contesting that label because they were supposedly bought by another party. Not reliable. And there are different levels of connection to the Russian government. They all share Russian themes: pro-Assad, pro-Putin, criticizing Democrats, Biden and Harris, easy on Trump, downplaying Trump's criminal acts, dismissing Russian interference. New slide. One level is the ecosystem identified, that's the first column, by the University of Washington Research. The second column is other media sites loosely connected to them that share Russian talking points. The third column is a partial list of the writers who are Russiagate skeptics, who also often share the Russian themes. These are not reliable media, and this isn't a complete list by any means. And another group is formerly trustworthy progressive sites that I used to use that now consistently promote Russian themes. Antiwar.com, Counterpunch, Consortium News, Information Clearinghouse, Op-Ed News. They're not reliable at this point. They certainly were in the past. Evaluating The Intercept and The Nation is more complicated. They have many excellent articles, but they also give prominent coverage to Russiagate skeptics, Glenn Greenwald and Stephen Cohen. Slide. These sites don't criticize Russia and often are easy on Trump. In this article, Greenwald criticizes the recent Atlantic article and journalists who used anonymous sources to confirm that Trump called soldiers who died in war suckers and losers. Journalists have used anonymous sources forever. Greenwald's article is just another example of his not so subtle support for Trump. Next. Sources to trust. While Twitter is often used to spread rumors and falsehoods, it's really also a great way to get quick analysis from some of the best minds in the country. Researchers and scholars can frequently identify the disinformation, the media manipulation, and provide invaluable commentary as news unfolds. Now, most of these people are on Twitter. Heather Cox Richardson is a historian who has daily analysis. They're posted on Facebook. And Nancy McLean is a historian with a very important book, Democracy in Chains. She's going to be present at a couple virtual forums here within the next 2 weeks. And just be careful who you follow on Twitter. Only follow people you know who are reliable sources. We've covered only a small part of the disinformation problem. Disinformation that downplays Russian interference, that criticizes Democrats more than Trump. It's meant to confuse us. It makes us feel cynical and hopeless. All of this muddles our thinking and discourages people from taking action. I hope our forum tonight helps you recognize and avoid disinformation and defeatism. Share this information with your friends. Let's take our lead from the indomitable Ruth Bader Ginsburg and do everything we can to win this November and to continue the struggle to make the US and the planet more democratic, equitable, and sustainable. Thank you.